I kind of got the sense that this next cycle would actually be characterized by us becoming entirely boring and normal. And I think that will be far more outrageous to some people in Bitcoin than everyone becoming, turbo orange pilled and being all about Bitcoin. I think the most outrageous thing that could happen to absolutely trigger the most hardcore Bitcoiners is for the world to accept Bitcoin and just go, yeah, that's cool. I like it now. Because there's something unsatisfactory about that, right? There's something missing, right? Because there's this assumed, I think, belief maybe culturally up until this point that if you're going to sort of grok Bitcoin really hard to a certain extent, you have to kind of question the whole matrix. You have to question your government and the way that you're living and your credit cards and your family and the way that you want to proceed in life and where you live and the kinds of schools you want to send your kids to and the things that you eat. Yeah, your food. And the worst thing that could possibly happen is for us to become totally normalized and that just be the end of it. We wake up and there's a Bitcoin ETF and price rips to $1 million of Bitcoin and it becomes fully adopted by these financial actors. And maybe it even starts to kind of roll out and start to become something that's, point of service transacted with. I know it already is, but say it becomes very universal in some way. And it just kind of have it, life goes on. Yeah, okay, I guess Bitcoin's $1 million a coin now. That would infuriate people because they want the world to change. We want the world to be different. We don't want to win and then have nothing change. You want to win and you want the world to change.
It's difficult to see that world actually playing out because even amongst ourselves, we don't agree. Like as a Bitcoin family, if you want to take it as an ideology, I mean, maybe this is typical of any ideologies because it's fair to say it's not just an investment. There's an ideology underlying it. And then much like, let's say within Christianity, you have all the different denominations who, broadly speaking, on the same page, but have some fundamental differences. You could say the same about Bitcoiners. And there are some Bitcoiners that are just, like, let's just take the ETF as an example. Oh, I don't care about the ETF, they'll say. I want more normies and, just plebs to be able to stack. I'm like, okay. That's all right. That's it seems like quite a noble goal. I don't know how long you want to ride that position for. Personally, I'd prefer it to happen sooner rather than later, but I understand the sentiment. So even within that particular issue, we don't necessarily agree. Some people goes, oh, well, we don't need BlackRock. Other people saying, hey guys, if we want to take this, this $500 billion asset and have it monetize some part of the $900 trillion out there, like it is going to have to be kind of mainstreamed. And we're going to find ourselves so far detached from the original cypherpunk ethos and everything around privacy. I mean, there's people that I know here and I've got really good relationships with them and I don't know their actual names. Like, I've got friends of mine who've just got NIMs and it's like this unspoken thing. And it's like, they come from that era. The 99%, they don't get that. Hey, I'm John Smith. I live over here. Here's my address. Here's my telephone number.
Yeah.
So there's so many different factions and groups within Bitcoin. But yeah, I think that would be an interesting one. The other thing I think about is also if governments come to this realization, which I don't think they will, that they need to be fiscally responsible, that also will be a bit of a blow. But that seems to me a very, very sort of, we'll call it a tail risk. Welcome to the show. It's really good to meet you. And I guess Bikes and Bitcoin is your handle. And I think, I think what I'll do is just paint a little picture just for context before we sort of dive into your background, just so that the audience gets a sense of kind of what brought us together here. So a little while ago, I put out a tweet about like, look, I know that Bitcoin can fix certain things in the world, but there's certain things that I can't see it fixing, things like crime and poverty and economic mismanagement, corruption, all these different types of things per se. And being a South African, obviously, I'm applying Bitcoin to the South African lens, and I'm going, it doesn't fix anything there in a big way, at least in the short term. And It was actually one of the more sort of engaged tweets I've ever made. And some people came back and said, well, you don't know Bitcoin if you're asking that question. And I was like, okay, I'm going to give you a specific example. What happens if I'm a South African living in a township? I don't have access to running water. I've got no free cash flow. I'm living hand to mouth. Explain to me how Bitcoin fixes this. And then the person came back and was like, well, in those circumstances, less so. Exactly.
Just dial it back.
Exactly.
Less.
Yeah. Like, I'm on the team, but let's also be realistic. And then you and I started engaging about your sort of take on how Bitcoin fixes this, as the meme goes. And I thought it was a very well considered, thoughtful approach. It was a piece that you had written, but not published. And I subsequently discovered that you published a piece in Bitcoin magazine that I remember referring to when I was in the shitcoin media world, about how Bitcoin Bitcoin miners are like the dung beetles of energy. And that just spoke to me because I was South African. And I was like, that's a great analogy. So anyway, again, that's the backdrop for everyone. Tell us a little bit about sort of your background, just so that people know kind of who we talking to, and then we can jump into that Bitcoin fixes it meme.
Oh, sure thing. So I've been interested and into Bitcoin since 2017. When I was in New Orleans, I was running a startup at the time, and like a lot of folks, I think there's maybe two reasons why people get into Bitcoin, and it's typically, at least in my mind, because you have to or because you're greedy. And so I fell into the latter case, where I saw this thing. I was running a company at the time. I thought, oh, this is cool. It's you buy something, it gets super expensive, and then you're wealthy. That's the end of it. So in that sense, I was kind of orange pilled from the number go up meme, but wasn't somebody who would really put in my 10,000 hours in the industry to really understand that it's not just an asset, it's also a network, and what that meant and why that was important. So started getting into Bitcoin, buying Bitcoin 2017. Was interested, got busy with the business in 2018, 2019, sort of started re-engaging, and then 2020, I had moved on from that organization, relocated up to Colorado, and with the advent of the 2020 lockdowns and all the governmental response that threw everybody online, and that really was pretty impactful to me to really go back and start to learn what Bitcoin was as a network, what it was as freedom money, what it was as unconfiscatable, uncensorable transactions and communications. And that really resonated with me at the time. And I decided then that I wanted to transition to working in the industry full time, and was producing content for Bitcoin Magazine, writing for them. I jumped on with an organization called Upstream Data that makes essentially a variety of ways that you can mine off grid. They make something called a hash generator that lets you go mine in the oil field. So if you've heard about people that are mitigating waste methane, which is something that folks like Daniel Batten or Troy Cross are very, very big on, they make the products essentially that help make that happen. So worked with the Upstream Data crew, and then transitioned recently to Riot Platforms, which is a large publicly traded US-based miner out of Texas. So we've got the largest single site facility out of Rockdale, which is about an hour outside of Austin, 750 megawatts coming off our own substation. And then we have broken ground, and we're building out a 1 gigawatt facility, which is 1,000 megawatts in Corsicana, which is outside of Texas. So with the Riot crew, manage our mining projects and operations analysis, have jumped in fully with both feet. Absolutely love the space. Cannot be more supportive of folks that want to jump in and contribute. And if you feel like it's the right thing, like I did, you'll find your place. As long as you keep kind of kicking around, eventually you figure out where you can be most valuable and support the industry.
100%, man. I think that's what I figured out. So I was writing, and then I jumped into this. And what you're saying about rights, it's interesting, because one of the guys over here in Australia, his name's Piers Cockram, he runs a company called MineRacks, and he did a presentation at our local Brisbane Bitcoin meetup some time ago, where he did a tour of the facility and just said it was like mind blowing. But of course, mining is one of those sectors that are incredibly competitive. Like, it is just wildly competitive. And I definitely want to pick your brain perhaps towards the end of today's discussion, just in terms of what's happening on the mining side, because I think obviously that's where your expertise lies. But maybe let's start out with sort of a philosophical level, because I quite like, yeah, I like philosophy. I like discussing these things. I actually did political philosophy at school, and when I read your piece, I had to sort of put on my uni cap or my college cap and start again, because I was like, okay, let's follow this argument step by step, because that's kind of how you lay it out. So you laid it out really well. And so let's unpack this. So at a high level, the objection that I had was really that it is too simplistic and too rudimentary a framework to say something along the lines of, Bitcoin fixes this in response to everything. And we need something a bit more intelligent, more nuanced, and something that actually resonates with people that are coming in. Because when we just throwing that sort of meme around, it's very easy for people that are detractors to dismiss us as being ideologues on the basis of just throwing these meaningless memes around. So it was important for us, for me at least, to say, let me know what I'm talking about, thought about this. So let's start with that. Okay, when you talk about the notion of Bitcoin fixes this, let's start just by unpacking, what do you mean by fix? And then we can start unpacking the thesis a bit further.
Sure thing. So yeah, this is really the crux of the argument, right? Is that everyone has been on Twitter and they have seen somebody post something, and then the immediate response to it is inevitably, Bitcoin fixes this, as if it's like some incantation that you can just summon, right? And then you say it 3 times and Bitcoin shows up and fixes your problem. And I thought that was, like, much like you were saying, it's just a naive interpretation. It's like saying, in an ideological sense, because we are fundamentally, we're going to have to deal with this next cycle. Bitcoin is becoming a popular ideology. Like, it's not just the cypherpunks and the libertarians arguing over technical implementations and these 1%, 2% changes in the protocol, and what are the philosophical implications of that. We're not talking to this broader population that when they hear a meme like Bitcoin fixes this, they just kind of use it wantonly. It becomes just a saying. It becomes almost meaningless in that sense, right? And I think that that's what you're trying to avoid and what I was trying to avoid. And so I actually, from the initial paragraphs of the argument that I was making in this piece, reject the idea that Bitcoin fixes it in the naive sense. And what's the naive sense? The naive sense is that somebody shows up with a toolkit and fixes your car because Bitcoin fixes this. And the naive sense is that, you get a bee sting and you shout Bitcoin at it 4 times and then it stops hurting. That's naive. What else can you say about fixing? To fix something is, you think like, oh, I repair it. But there's another way. There's another way that you can think about fixing. You could think about fixing in the case of, like, to fix a boxing match. Well, what does that mean? It doesn't mean you repair the boxing match. It means you've set up the winner to already be the winner. It means that you've rigged the game. Now, in this sense, I don't mean fix as in we've rigged something, but fix as in a fix. Like if I were to fix siding to my wall, or I was to fix a picture to my wall, I'm not repairing something. What I'm doing is I'm making it stable. I'm making it steady. I'm making it not sort of float or be up in the air. So if we go back to that boxing example, if I fix a fight, I've made the outcome stable. I've made it known. You don't know the outcome to a boxing match. That's why there's a gambling market on it, because you can decide which side you want, and then you can win or lose money on it. So that's really the initiation of the argument, is that if fiat is the enemy, fiat being by decree, we talk about fiat money. It's money by decree. It's money by trust. The counter to that is something that is not by decree. It's not sort of ephemeral, or you just say it and it's true. It's something that's firm. And so to say Bitcoin fixes this, we should really think about it in the sense of Bitcoin makes this thing firm. What does it make firm, or what does it make immovable?
Yes, absolutely. That makes perfect sense. And it addresses the issue of superficiality, which I think is where the meme can fall short. So building on that now, all right, if we're saying that Bitcoin fixes the things, not repairing its sense, in your piece you even spoke about like pulling a weed from a garden and something like that. It's about trying to lay a bedrock, granite, instead of building a house on a bunch of sand or things like that. I think let's now go a little bit deeper, because the implication then is, all right, fiat as it stands today, a system by decree based on trust, um, is what I think you call in the piece sort of a bad faith economy. And then a sound money or hard money standard is what you would probably call as a good faith economy. So perhaps unpack those concepts and then tie it into, I guess, your original point.
Sure. So this idea of like a good faith or a bad faith economy is, if you're familiar with the sort of concept of like you're engaging in good faith or you're acting in good faith, intuitively this is like if you're having a conversation with somebody on Twitter, right? You know, the Twitterverse is where the heart of, you know, the Bitcoin ecosystem seems to be, as much as Noster what might want to pull us away. If you're engaging with somebody in bad faith, you might have an interaction with somebody where they're making these ad hominem attacks. You post something and then they reply to you by saying, "Oh, that's the kind of thing that, you know, the laser eyes would say." It would be the same thing as you going to somebody who's an environmentalist and starting out the conversation with, "Oh, here come the tree hugging hippies."
Yeah.
It's a dig, but it's a representation of behaving in bad faith, which is that if we're going to be, you know, grown and intellectual individuals and really try to figure this thing out by thinking through and having a conversation, if you're engaging with somebody in bad faith, it means that you are undercutting your ability to actually meet that person on an intellectual level. You're sort of arguing in a different kind of way. You're arguing using mechanisms that aren't really oriented around finding the truth, but rather because you kind of want to get your way. The way that this sort of bad faith economy, the way that I'm kind of conceptualizing it, is that this is the kind of present tense world that we live in. We live in a world where, because we have fiat money and because we have money that is sort of the tail end of the whip of the decisions of, you know, the lords of finance above us, everyone is closer or trying to get closer and closer to the money spigot, which has been sort of talked about ad nauseum from all of the sort of macro big boys in the Bitcoin ecosystem, where there's an advantage to being closer to the source of the cash, and there's an advantage to not telling the truth. There's an advantage to engaging inappropriately with a system, because if you think that you can get some insider information, or if you think that somebody can give you insider information, you don't have the incentive to participate in the economy in a good faith manner. What you're incentivized to do is sort of get your little corner of the universe that gives you an unfair advantage, so that you can squeeze whatever juice you can get out of the orange, so to speak. So the way that this idea kind of connects to making firm is the idea that if we live in this kind of fiat economy, which I don't think you could kind of belabor the point with more examples, but I think anyone who's listening to your podcast probably accepts that as a general premise, right? That we are not really living in a hard money world, and because we're not living in a hard money world, people are incentivized to kind of do shisty things to get a little bit more than they may potentially be earned, or to get things in ways that they might otherwise not be able to get them, by being closer to the right people, by brushing the right shoulders, by getting the right interest rates, by having access to something they shouldn't have access to. And this bad faith economy is a bit of the sort of explainer of the consequences, right? The consequences of what we see, where if value is something that is just decreed, if it's something that's just free floating, if it's something that we're all sitting there waiting for Jerome Powell to tell us what's going to happen, and then we have to jump when he says jump, and when he says jump, we have to ask how high, you start to get these odd outcomes, because people are not behaving in a way where they're engaging in a sort of level playing field. They're not engaging in good faith. They're engaging in these kind of bizarre ways where they're just trying to get what they can get based on what they're hearing. I mean, we can kind of go into like the bizarro world. I know that it's been...
Sorry, just to tap onto that there, Rob. What you're saying, I mean, I think in a sense, the implication is, within this fiat world, we don't actually live in a free and open free market economy in the way that sort of Preston Pitch would talk about it. Like, there's almost nothing that is free and open other than Bitcoin, because, you know, and I'll use the example here of housing, but I mean, it's something that you've referred to in your piece, was, you know, there are so many different levers that the policymakers here in Australia have played with historically on the supply and the demand side to keep propping up the house price because it's politically expedient to keep house prices up. It's not a nice thing for people to see a significant chunk of their net wealth, at least here in Australia, like something like 80% of people's net wealth is tied up in their primary residence. So
Oh, wow.
of course they're going to get upset when it goes down. So all the incentives are stacked up in a way to keep the sort of party going, as it were. And so it's completely manipulated in that way. And then, I refer to like a piece that you've got here where, when the fiat bureaucrats decide that they'll put their finger on the scale on the economy, they do so by changing treasury rates and asset prices to respond, in inverted commas. In this way, the bureaucrats change the value of an asset by changing how the asset is measured. And this is really sort of the case of a bad faith economy where, as you were saying earlier, we're sitting there trying to cling on to Jay Powell's every words. What did he say? How did he say it? Did he hint this? What's the suggestion? Are they going to tighten? When they're going to tighten? Because everyone's just clinging onto the central planner's word. And then what happens from there is it just ripples through capital markets and asset prices across the world, writ large, quite honestly. And that's what's so amazing. You've got these small amounts of policymakers in the US who can literally just put their finger on the scale, and it has an enormous ripple effect across emerging economies and everywhere in the world.
And it incentivizes the most bizarre things you'll ever see.
Yes, let's talk about the bizarre things. I want to hear some examples.
Well, I don't want to, you don't want to belabor the point, right? This idea of like what you measured measures you. If you're familiar with the idea of like a recursive function, it's like a function where the input changes the output, which changes the input, which changes the output. And we're just in this very odd, there's a philosopher who sort of coined this idea of a ruler, his ruler, Wittgenstein's ruler, which is the idea that if you measure a table with a ruler, you're also measuring the ruler with a table, which is, you can go 1,000 layers deep on that, right? We don't have to get into his full tractate to kind of understand the general concept. But you wind up with this bizarre kind of feedback cycle of floating expectations and floating outcome and ever more volatile behavior when you have, like you're mentioning, Jay Powell putting his finger on the scale. You have him putting his finger on the scale because he is trying to make expectations-based decisions, which to me is a bizarre thing because you can't control expectations. So you've already set the stage that you're going to try to put the finger on the scale, but you're going to do so in a way that's to make me believe something, which already doesn't seem connected to the real world. But then I'm supposed to respond to that as if you're just putting your finger on the scale to generate an outcome. But I know that you're incentivized to lie to me because you're trying to change my expectations because you think the outcome comes after the expectations. So I'm going to change my behavior and act as if somebody is lying to me because you are lying to me. So now you're looking at me trying to make decisions, you being Jay Powell, making decisions about what I expect, but I already think you're lying to me, so I've already changed my behavior. So whatever decision you make is already based on the fact that I'm acting different. So it's this very bizarre recursive function where everyone is constantly changing their behavior in response to what they think is going to happen based on somebody who is lying to them when they decide to make that change. And you're constantly changing, at least what, Jay Powell is doing, and the whole suite of bureaucrats in that institution is that they're changing the length of the ruler, trying to change the length of the table. They're saying, oh, if we just change rates, say that's the ruler, they're trying to change something like inflation. We're trying to change the economy by changing the ruler. And so it's this very bizarre recursive function. You can kind of talk about it in the purely financial sense. I think, this essay that I wrote really didn't go into the sort of squishy social aspects. We didn't talk about drug-addled SoundCloud rappers or people wanting to pick, 4,000 genders or the sort of social blossoming of whatever it is that's happening now, the zeitgeist of the current moment.
The lack of objective truth, in a sense.
That's what it is. And so you could go down that rabbit hole, but I think, there's probably 1,000 sociologists coming out of 1,000 universities that are already doing that work. And I think part of opting into Bitcoin is that you don't necessarily want to to study, all of the bizarre ways in which people can, destroy truth and live in a postmodern world. A lot of what brings people to Bitcoin is that they're just sick of being confused. They're just sick of things just not making sense.
Yes.
Decisions being made that don't line up, and so they want something fixed. They want something solid. They don't want something fiat. And just one aside before we kind of move on is that if you noticed in this last, folks in sort of the class of 2020, 2021, 2023, there was this really interesting sort of, call it a cultural upswing in Bitcoin adoption by not just folks who would be sort of conservative in the American political scheme, but folks who were very religious. And what was very interesting about that is that you had a lot of folks who had very strong sort of faith-based ideologies, whether it's, Christianity or Judaism or they were Muslim, but people who had this sort of sense of, like, say, call it a fixed theological identity, who all of a sudden showed up and started grokking hard money and found this very, very, the world just keeps getting more bizarre as Bitcoin grows because all sorts are kind of coming in, found kind of odd bedfellows with, the OG cypherpunks and the anarcho-libertarians and all the other weirdos, myself included, who had kind of shown up in the space. But we all got along because we were all interested in the same thing, which was something fixed, making something firm. So a bit of an aside, but an interesting note. I don't know if
that is true.
Folks in your audience who sort of saw that, right? Because that was a big part of the zeitgeist in 2020, 21, 22.
It's definitely part of it. I mean, I think there's firstly like a sense of opting out, because you can participate in the cultural warfare, which leaves you pretty dissatisfied either which way, and it's perpetual. And I suppose most of us who have studied Bitcoin have also studied a little bit of history and know that what we're seeing right now is another one of those. Like, this is what tends to happen when we get towards the end of a long-term debt cycle, when we see the end of a sort of economic hegemony, like the end of a world reserve currency. These are the kinds of trends we see. That's where we see the inequality and the conflict and the division and the populism on the left and the right. You also see apparently this is what Douglas Murray, a conservative commentator, has said, is that towards the end of empires, there is a huge obsession about gender. And obviously we've seen that over the last decade. So, I've said this before. I spent a couple of years before Bitcoin becoming a cultural expert in all things US politics, and really trying to go like, and that was when I was like, the media is full of shit. This is not real. They're lying to me all the time. And then that's already just pushed me onto the other team. Okay, you've got that view. I'm going to join the other team. And then you start getting angry. And then you say, like, hold on, this is actually not good for my well-being. I don't feel any better. I'm in a constant cycle of like getting angry. The social media overlords, algorithms, getting me more and more enraged by the day, push me further and further down this particular rabbit hole. And it's actually not fun.
No.
So it is about the strange bedfellows, because it is really strange, because there is a unlikely alliance in many ways, but there seems to be, I mean, you've got the Jimmy Songs of the world, who's very religious, and there seems to be a lot of people like him, very much family oriented people, as you say, conservative, and that's a big thing. And I spoke to Jimmy Song about that. Was like, it's fascinating to me that sort of there just seems to be this alignment between Bitcoiners and the importance of family. And then I chatted to, I guess, Katie the Russian last week, and she was saying, like, life before she had a child was like, she was angry. She was a anarcho-capitalist, and the state and this and this and that. And then she had a child, and then she started engaging with her surrounding community. And then she's like, do you know what? It doesn't matter who's in the White House. It matters who I'm surrounded by. And
that's right.
And then that kind of stuff. And I guess that's where you're going to. I guess before we go on to sort of other topics, let's just finish up the Bitcoin fixes thing. So, all right, so we're saying, okay, we're not talking about repairing. We're talking about a fixing. We're talking about creating a really strong foundation from the ground up. We're talking about building a good faith economy as opposed to a bad faith economy with all the negative incentives around that. I suppose it seems to me, and I recall you touching on this, but there is almost a point of like, well, it's not as if you go from having one system one day and then another the next. How does that transition work? And is that the way you're thinking about it? Is it almost as if some of these Bitcoin values and a good faith economy over time, as more people store their wealth in this unconfiscatable asset, they kind of, and opting out of everything, it sort of infiltrates, and then we on aggregate become more good faith? I mean, how does that work in your mind?
Yeah. Fundamentally, Bitcoin is a technology, right? It in the pure sense, everything that we kind of talk about in the cultural sphere around it is just made up in our heads. It's a technology. It enables us to do certain things. And precisely in line with that, technology can be used for call it positive or moral good. It could be used for negative, for moral bad. You just have to ask somebody who had their hard drive encrypted and had to send somebody Bitcoin to unlock it, whether they think Bitcoin is good or bad. And they might think it's bad because hell, I have to send these assholes Bitcoin, this like super shadowy, evil stuff that, only these sort of low-key hackers would use. If you ask that person, it's a tool being used inappropriately. But obviously, as we've seen in the industry, it can be used in really, really important ways to maintain and defend human rights, to allow folks to protect their wealth, to allow folks to transact without censorship or fear of censorship. There's all this good that can come out of it. And I tend to think about things on these sort of long-term cultural historical trends, and how does technology enable you to do certain things. There was a time when a good example, and there's a good book that kind of ties into mining by Vaclav Smil called Energy and Civilization. It's very dense. I highly recommend you do not read it. Are really geeking out on mining and energy, but he does a beautiful job kind of covering energy, starting all the way back to food. Not even talking about coal plants or burning wood. He talks about food. And he talks about the technology of farming and how farming changed the way society was shaped, because if you could grow something, particularly wheat is really foundational to the birth of human cities, because you could grow it and it produced a lot of calories. And so in the good sense, wheat was this very powerful technology, if we can call it that, this very powerful tool, because it allowed folks to organize, to collect, and that allowed you to have more specialized societies, because not everybody is a hunter-gatherer now, because I can get a loaf of bread and I can eat this bread and I can not die. I don't have to go hunt in the woods, or I don't have to go fishing for 8 hours just to take care of myself. And I'm not just sort of even tending my own plot. There's this whole extension where farming starts to become industrialized, particularly in the US. But what's the downside to wheat? The downside to wheat is that wheat is not as appropriately spread in terms of its like mineral content and its vitamin content. And so the downside of wheat is that you may be vitamin and mineral deficient if you are only subsiding on this new technology and you're not supplementing it with other things. I mean, nowadays, of course, you just eat 100% meat and you lift heavy weights and you're a true Bitcoiner. But there's always a trade-off to the technology, right? And in the same way with Bitcoin, what does it set us up to do? In the same way that wheat, being something that was relatively fast-growing, high caloric content, and you could produce a ton of it, helped us establish organized human societies. What does Bitcoin let us do? It drives out bad money, and so you assume that it starts to sort of pull back the effectiveness of all those nasty things that you see that might be considered the greatest abuses of finance. So it starts to dial back the way in which folks wind up in, say, predatory lending situations, or they wind up overspending in a very heavy debt situation, because it's very hard to lend against Bitcoin because nobody wants to give away their Bitcoin. The money is not cheap, so nobody's just going to give you 50 grand. So if people think about the money in a different way, if the money is something fixed, if the money is something that's programmatic, if you know how much of it there will ever be, and you know how often it's being issued every 10 minutes roundabout, and you know how much is being issued roundabout every 10 minutes, and if you have to, now you can buy it, but there may well be a day in the future that you're going to have to work to get Bitcoin, where you won't just be able to go and, of course, there'll be various currencies, but you may not be able to just go to an exchange and buy half a Bitcoin. And that won't necessarily just be because the price is so high. So you have to think about, okay, what kind of a world does it enable if you fundamentally change a technology, that being money and the ability to transact? What are the consequences? And I think we're only at the very, very beginnings of that, right? I think that everything we're trying to do now in the Bitcoin world is just to get people to start to kind of understand. But I think in the same way that, and it's become a meme in the same way as Bitcoin fixes this, but saying, you're early, but we're so stinking early. And I thought we were early, I thought I was late in 2017. I thought I was late in 2020. And then in 2021 and 2022 and 2023, all I can think of is how early we are, because there's so much FUD. There's so much, misinformation. There's so many ridiculous things being said. And it's not just people who hate Bitcoin. Now there's this whole clutch of people that love Bitcoin, but we just wish they knew more about it. We wish they didn't say these memes as sort of the cheap answer to everything. Bitcoin fixes this. Well, what do you mean, right? So I think there's a lot to be done. But the good thing about this space is that I think that folks are really incentivized to learn, because once you start to get it, you get a taste, and then you want the whole thing.
Yeah, I've always stopped telling people to buy Bitcoin, and I'm actually just telling people to go learn about it. Even as we watch it go on a little bit of a run right now, I think at the time of recording, I think it's just over 31,000, which is like, I think 75% up year to date. I think for the average person, it's quite hard to look at that and go, all right, should I just wait for it to pull back, or what should I do? But actually, yeah, I think to that point, I'm just telling people, like, go and actually learn about it. And then, when you say that we're early, I mean, I totally agree. In some ways, and I've had this conversation with a few different people. In some ways, I feel like this transition to, and I say hyper Bitcoinization in a sense of Bitcoin is widely adopted. I'm not talking about, it's a unit of accounts or anything like that. I don't think that's going to happen in my lifetime. But sometimes I think it will take 20, 30 years. And sometimes I think it could take 10. And it's really difficult to tell, because sometimes there's that saying that Lennon had, which was like, there are weeks when years happen, or something to that effect. You know
That's
what I mean?
right, yeah.
Something to that effect. Where, like, there's just like these massive shifts, and I think COVID was an example of that, where it's like within a few weeks we had years worth of sort of, I guess, future trends that were compressed, because suddenly it's like, you're not allowed to work in the office. Okay, well, we got to make a plan. Well, it turns out like we're going in that direction anyway. And now there's culturally, at least in different parts of the world, like a whole barrier to going into the office. I mean, here in Australia, it's fascinating. Sydney and Melbourne have very different attitudes about going back to work than Brisbane. And it just depends on what your experience was during the lockdown. If you were someone who was locked in like Melbourne for 280 odd days in a year, yeah, you probably are less inclined to go in, whereas Brisbane didn't have that.
Wow.
And, because everything was on a state-wide level, like the US. So, yeah, it's interesting in that sense. And so when you think about the FUD, as you mentioned, that persists today, I mean, I feel like we're beyond Bitcoin is for criminals. I feel like we're almost beyond Bitcoin wastes energy, because there's a lot of just great news out there. There's just, even mainstream media is getting it semi-right. I mean,
Yeah.
what are some of the other sort of areas where you're just seeing persistent misinformation, whether it's intentional or not?
It's a good question, because it does feel like the tide is turning in a very funny way. Like, like you're saying, there was Forbes articles coming out providing particularly fair coverage, and then there was actually fair coverage on Bitcoin's utilization to fund terrorism, where a bunch of folks came out and said, like, oh, actually it's not a good tool because it's highly trackable.
Yeah.
So it does seem like the tone has shifted, which is really interesting. It's hard to say, right? It's hard to say. What I'm actually getting a sense of is the opposite in an odd way. I'm getting the sense, and I kind of thought this would happen when we were going through last cycle. I kind of got the sense that this next cycle would actually be characterized by us becoming entirely boring and normal. And I think that will be far more outrageous to some people in Bitcoin than everyone becoming, turbo orange pilled and being all about Bitcoin. I think the most outrageous thing that could happen to absolutely trigger the most hardcore Bitcoiners is for the world to accept Bitcoin and just go, yeah, that's cool. I like it now.
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
there's something unsatisfactory about that, right? There's
yeah.
something missing, right? Because there's this assumed I think belief maybe culturally up until this point that if you're going to sort of grok Bitcoin really hard to a certain extent, you have to kind of question the whole matrix. You have to
Yeah.
question your government and the way that you're living and your credit cards and your family and the way that you want to proceed in life and where you live and the kinds of schools you want to send your
Your
kids to and
food.
the things that you eat. Yeah, your food. And the worst thing that could possibly happen is for us to become totally normalized and
Yeah.
that just be the end of it. We wake up and there's a Bitcoin ETF and price rips to $1 million of Bitcoin and it becomes fully adopted by these financial actors. And maybe it even starts to kind of roll out and start to become something that's, point of service transacted with. I know it already is, but say it
Yeah.
becomes very universal in some way. And it just kind of have it, life goes on. Yeah, okay, I guess Bitcoin's $1 million a coin now. That would infuriate people
Yeah.
because they
Yeah.
want the world to change. We want the world to be different. We don't want to win and then have nothing change. You want to win and you want the world to change.
It's difficult to see, yeah, it's difficult to see that actually playing out because even amongst ourselves, we don't agree. Like as a Bitcoin family, if you want to take it as an ideology, I mean, maybe this is typical of any ideologies because it's fair to say it's not just an investment. There's an ideology underlying it. And then much like, let's say within Christianity, you have all the different denominations who, broadly speaking, on the same page, but have some fundamental differences. You could say the same about Bitcoiners. And there are some Bitcoiners that are just, like let's just take the ETF as an example. Oh, I don't care about the ETF, they'll say. I want more normies and, just plebs to be able to stack. I'm like, okay, that's all right. It seems like quite a noble goal. I don't know how long you want to ride that position for. Personally, I'd prefer it to happen sooner rather than later,
Yep.
but I understand the sentiment. So even within that particular issue, we don't necessarily agree. Some people goes, oh well, we don't need BlackRock. Other people saying, hey guys, if we want to take this $500 billion asset and have it monetize some part of the $900 trillion out there, like it is going to have to be kind of mainstreamed. And we're going to find ourselves so far detached from the original cypherpunk ethos and everything around privacy. I mean, there's people that I know here and I've got really good relationships with them, and I don't know their actual names. Like, I've got
Yeah.
friends of mine who've just got NIMs, and it's like this unspoken thing. And it's like they come from that era. The 99%, they don't get that. Hey, I'm John Smith. I live over here. Here's my address. Here's my telephone number.
Yeah.
So there's so many different factions and groups within Bitcoin. But yeah, I think that would be an interesting one. The other thing I think about is also if governments come to this realization, which I don't think they will, that they need to be fiscally responsible, that also will be a bit of a blow. But that
Yeah.
seems to me a very, very sort of, we'll call it a tail risk.
That's right. Yeah.
I guess moving on from sort of the philosophical now, and perhaps I can just tap your brain on some of the Bitcoin mining stuff, because it's been really fascinating. It's just a kind of, I would describe myself as an absolute layperson when it comes to mining. I understand a little bit about it, but fundamentally, like the idea that hash rate was ripping at a time when retail was not even there, sentiment's just sort of flat. I mean, talk to us a little bit about like what your interpretation is of hash rate as a metric of networks health, because as far as we can tell, it's as healthy as ever, but the price certainly hasn't reflected that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, what do Bitcoin miners do, right? Is we essentially allow you to transact. So we're the ones who are producing blocks. We don't do it for free. We do it because we're profit seeking, and we control the issuance control the issuance. We regulate the issuance of Bitcoin, right? So we build blocks. So hashing all that is us taking all of your transactions that you've submitted to the mempool and finalizing them in the blockchain. Finding a block and adding it to the blockchain, and we do that on average every 10 minutes. And that's really the two things that we do. And we don't do it out of the goodness of our hearts. We do it because we're trying to make money. because we're just, absolutely savage, dirty, rotten capitalists. And this is the most important thing that I think people should really remember about the industry of Bitcoin mining, is that ideological Bitcoin miners die. You cannot be a large scale ideological Bitcoin miner, at least in my opinion, because at the end of the day, you have to power your machines with something. And it doesn't matter if you are taking vented methane and you're running it into a generator and you are mining Bitcoin off of that generator set, that gen set, It doesn't matter if you are mining Bitcoin off of stranded hydropower or stranded solar power. It doesn't matter if you are the size of Riot and you've got this huge financial hedge and you're a financial player and you're selling energy back to the grid. You're not doing it for free. You're doing it because you make money doing it. And people don't really think about Bitcoin mining as a business. They think about it as a concept. They think hash rate is a single number, and that single number can be divided down into machines that are doing work. And they never think any further than that. They don't think to themselves, okay, 400 and something exahash is, what are we at now? We're at 482 exahash is our current network hash rate. Huge, massive, an inconceivably large amount of work being done. It's a decentralized group of people that are doing that, of organizations and individuals. And the way that they are all doing it, functionally, the machines that are working are doing the exact same thing. But the way that every single one of those people or entities pay their bills are all different. And that's what everybody forgets about Bitcoin mining, or doesn't sort of think all the way down to understand Bitcoin mining, is that everyone is doing something different to procure and consume electricity. Because we think electricity is just, and it's, it's the luxury of us being, 21st century human beings, is that the hardest thing most of us have had to do with electricity is, if we're traveling international, find the right plug adapter so I can charge my phone, right? That's about the hardest thing. Oh, this is
hello
a
there
plug, and that's the end of it. You don't think about where your electricity comes from. You don't think about the various ways that your electricity is made. You don't think about the fact that the demand for electricity at any given moment is constantly changing. People need less electricity at 3 a.m. or 2 a.m. than they do at 5 or 6 in the afternoon when the kids got home from school, the TV's on, somebody's playing music, somebody's cooking dinner on an electrical stove, they're charging the car in the driveway. They don't think about that. But electricity is a grid, it is a business, it has a lot of smart people that have been balancing supply and demand for years and years and years, and taking all forms of electrical generation and having to balance those on a singular grid. And these singular grids, there are various grids even all over the US, all over the world, and some folks that aren't even connected to the grid. So I think the biggest thing to remember with Bitcoin mining is that, fundamentally it's a business. And so the exahash that you see, that kind of nameplate number, tells you how many people are playing the game. People in the sense of, the total combined processing power of the machines playing the game.
Yeah.
But what it doesn't tell you is, it doesn't tell you how those people are paying the bills. And that's where mining starts to get really interesting, because you start to find all these ways that we can contribute to the world around us.
Totally. And when you look at the different mining companies, and there's ones with different strategies, some like to hold Bitcoin in the balance sheet, others are very light on debt, and they like to just kind of offload it as it goes. What do you think is going to be, I guess, what is and I suppose this is difficult saying, but what is a conservative, sustainable way to be a miner? Because I think we saw that there were a couple players in the last cycle that kind of went long, leveraged long on the sort of holding Bitcoin on their balance sheet, and they got all washed out. And there's some that are a lot more conservative who seem to be doing better today and appear better positioned for the halving next year, which is obviously when, I guess in theory, profitability is impacted really dramatically. So talk to us a little bit about the different kind of models that miners employ, and how they compete with each other in that regard.
That's a great question. I think, fundamentally, Adam Back, one of the few, if not only living people who are quoted in the white paper, said it very eloquently, because he has a company, Blockstream, that participates in mining. He said that you have to be a chicken shack miner, which in some sense implies that you have to be the smartest person driving the shittiest car. I don't know if you can curse in this podcast, but
yeah. Fine.
you have to be the most strategic. You have to be living on a ramen budget always. You have to be finding the most cost effective ways to do what you do, because you know that what you're doing every 4 years is only going to get harder. There's always going to be a halving. Issuance is going to drop by half, which means if you're only making money through Bitcoin, then that revenue stream is cut in half. And you can make up some of that by what we assume is going to be this price appreciation, because historically Bitcoin has been cyclical, and folks have kind of looked at the halving as the event that sort of initiates that cyclicality. It kind of initiates this bull run. And historically that's been the case when you look at the charts, is that you get a halving and you get, some appreciation into the halving, and then maybe you get some volatility, and then you start to just rip after the halving. That is a difficult way to make a business model. If you were going to write a business model that says every 4 years I expect that half of my income stream is going to now come to me, but it's okay because price is going to go up, you will get laughed out of the room of like any bank that you go to get funded, or any venture capitalist that is going to go fund you, right? They'll say that's great, but we don't invest on hopes and dreams. In terms of the model that you can employ to ensure profitability, it really has to do with the way in which first off, it has to deal with how big you are, right? Because how big you are is really contingent on the size of the business you're going to run. In the same way that Costco in the US sells a $1.50 hot dog, them selling a $1.50 hot dog does not put, there's a really great restaurant in New Orleans called Dat Dog. They make these very fancy hot dogs, and they charge like $7.50, $8.50 for a hot dog. Costco did not put Dat Dog out of business. They're both making hot dogs. It would be naive to say that, just the lowest cost operator is the person who's going to live. Because in business, there's always some other incentive. There's some other way that, you can charge more or less. And so you're drawing a different customer base. So the question is, what role does Bitcoin serve, and at what scale does Bitcoin serve that role, Bitcoin mining? So at the smallest scale, the best example I have is when we bought our house, the prior owner had put a solar array on the roof, and they had paid it off. So they have this paid off solar on the roof.
Yeah.
And so we don't use tons and tons of electricity, and what we have on the roof is sufficient to power our house. I can run a miner all winter, and the heat from that miner I actually pump into my house. So I get excess heat through wintertime. So I run my furnace less. So I'm not having to pay as much on my gas bill because it's a gas furnace.
Mm.
I'm making Bitcoin, and I'm getting essentially free electricity to power my space heater, my home heater.
Yeah.
So that's a very, very small scale business model where I am making money by offsetting my gas price, and I am making money by generating Bitcoin by running my machine. And I'm using the fact that this machine spits out a lot of hot air to do that. Now, could I do that with 20 machines? Nope. I don't have enough solar, and I don't need to be sweating every day I wake up. There's a certain point where it breaks down. I can't have 20 machines pumping heat into my basement because I'm going to cook everybody in the house. That model, if we call it a model, is just as financially competitive as somebody like Riot. So I don't speak on behalf of Riot. Obviously, Riot's a publicly traded company, but Riot has an energy strategy. So they participate in programs where ERCOT, which is the grid that they operate on, they give Riot a call because Riot has signed up for a series of programs and say, hey, you signed up for this program that said that when we need to call you, you will give us 100 megawatts, 200 megawatts, make up a number. And then Riot will shut down that much capacity. And then there is 100, 200, whatever megawatts for ERCOT to send somewhere else to use. I can't do that strategy on my solar array. I can't. But Riot can do that strategy with almost 100,000 machines on their first site. And that's a fantastic business model because they're playing in the energy market. They're controlling whether they're off or whether they're on. They're working with their grid operator, and the grid operator is saying, hey, we need this electricity. Or sometimes it's the opposite. Hey, we need you to stay on. We need you to keep 100 megawatts running. So there's all sorts of programs that that Riot can participate in on the grid, so that ERCOT can call them and can essentially pay them to either ramp up or to stay on or to curtail, whatever it might be. That is an extremely competitive way to run a business. And where I think a lot of the pain is, because you have to be a strong financial operator. You have to know how to not get over leveraged. And a lot of these publicly traded companies, or these large operators, like you said, they made really big leverage bets. They took on way more debt than they should have, and unfortunately, they got liquidated. Much to the injury of their investors or to the folks that were hosting with them.
Yeah.
If your sole understanding of the mining business model is that I pay 7 cents a kilowatt hour and I run my machine and I have 20 machines, you're going to have a bad time. Where I think we're going is that folks on the edges, the very large folks, the very small folks, or folks who can work these very particular, very niche deals, are going to be the folks who survive, but they're always going to be focused on the business. They're not even necessarily going to be focused on securing the network in an ideological sense, but they will 100% be focused on keeping their revenues coming.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. And I love your story about like what you're doing at home. Some people here, I mean, obviously we don't have an issue with cold here in Australia. In fact, we have the opposite. And the first thing that, as you were describing that, I was wondering was like, are there going to be consumer applications that involve mining that Australians could employ? Because we have pretty high power costs, relatively speaking, which makes mining pretty challenging as it is. But to your earlier point of, okay, well, in your case, you're using some of the heat used by the machines, and you're pumping it through the house, and then you use your furnace less. This might be a dumb question, but is there any way that one can leverage mining and harness that energy to kind of cool your house or do something else? Like, you could use it to sort of heat up your pool or something. Like, I'm trying to think of something here in Australia that could actually work, because what I'm imagining is, fast forward 10, 20 years, it just makes sense to have this small little device that at the same time is earning Bitcoin, but is fulfilling some other sort of utility within the house, cooling, heating, whatever it might be.
The best example is the water heater.
Yeah.
So you can, at least in the US, it's readily available to get options that are electric heaters or gas heaters. And there's some folks who there's nothing really on the market now that's very accessible, right? But with an electric heating system, you can use a Bitcoin miner to heat your water, because at least the way that most homes in the US are, is that you have 50 to 100 gallons of hot water sitting in a tank, typically somewhere in your basement, and that water is always sitting at 100 something degrees, whatever you set that at. Now, Bitcoin mining can be used to heat water in that kind of way, and there's even some machines that are modified that cool themselves with water or cool themselves with immersion oils that may make that a little bit easier. That is one of the most ready examples. The only catch with heating water is that your water heater kind of ramps up and gets very, 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 very hot, and then kind of drops down and maintains the heat.
Yeah.
A Bitcoin miner can't do that. A Bitcoin miner just wants to go. It just wants to keep mining and to have stability.
Yeah.
So that's kind of I would think, more technical problem that somebody needs to solve to put a Bitcoin miner into a water heater. But absolutely, I wouldn't be surprised. Anywhere that you need heat, there are a lot of places where you need to get rid of energy. So very large boats, when they idle their engines, they oftentimes don't want to power down and power up these very, very large diesel engines.
Yeah.
And so they will use these mechanisms that are basically, they pump in water, because you're on a boat, you're in the water. They pump in water and they dump extra electricity into a load bank, which is essentially just a bunch of electrical coils that gets really, really hot. Because if I'm heating something, the consequence of that is heat. You can't create or destroy energy. Energy becomes something else. So they're turning that electricity coming from idling that engine at, say, 1,500 RPM. they leave it there, but instead of powering the boat, they send the energy to this load bank that gets super, super, super hot. And the water that the boat is sitting in helps to cool that off. And so you have this device whose sole purpose is to waste energy.
Yeah.
That's literally the whole purpose of a load bank, is that I need to keep my engine idling at, say, 1500 RPM. So I can't ramp it up. I can't ramp it down. I have to do something with that energy. So there's potentially something there. I would think that'd be a pretty hard environment to be in, because it's going to be something where you're dealing with a boat. So you're on the water. It's going to be humid. It might be salt water.
Yeah.
So it could be chaos, but hey, let's just like put the bug in the ear of all the engineers so that they can solve those problems in the coming years.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I thought that I'm not technical at all. And, I don't know the least bit about energy and how like all these things work, but I'm sure there's smart enough people that are going to figure these things out. And there is some sort of device that I've always thought would be quite cool. It's sort of like a single miner. So, and I don't know if it's a USB stick or whatever it is. And it's almost like a little lotto ticket. So I think it costs like, say, $50 or whatever. And I just imagine one day you just are able to, one day you sort of just open your wallet and you see sort of the Bitcoin reward there.
Reward.
Yeah, I mean, but the odds are statistically so crazy. A friend of mine asked me recently, like, what's the odds of AI guessing your seed phrase? And it came out that you would need the odds were the same as if you won the lotto 9 times in a row. More or less. So it's really,
and not the small lotto, the Mega Millions, the big
yes,
ones.
exactly. Rob, there's so many more things I could chat to you about, but I think unfortunately we've run out of time for today. It's been absolutely fantastic. I really enjoyed your nuanced take. It's nice to talk to someone who's passionate and knowledgeable about things, but has a very moderate, nuanced approach, because sometimes I find myself getting swayed by all the laser-eyed psychopaths, of which I'm, myself susceptible to from time to time. So it's been a real pleasure. Did you want to send the listeners anywhere, any content or anything like that?
No, just come and say hi on Twitter. On Bikes and Bitcoin. Always happy to talk about this stuff. I'm learning along with everyone else. We're all figuring it out together. And I think that, if anything, let's just keep having these good faith conversations, because we're going to keep growing. The industry is going to keep growing. We're going to keep bringing new people into the space, and we're going to be building some interesting stuff over the next, 5-10 years. So it's better to do that when you can disagree, but not be disagreeable, right?
Yes, absolutely. No, I think that's a good note to leave it off on. So Rob, yeah, as I say, a real pleasure to meet you, and thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I loved it.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed the conversation and that you got some value out of it. Either way, hit me up on Twitter and let me know what you think. My handle is Dale21M. If you've got any suggestions as to people you think I should be talking to or topics I should address too, I would love that sort of feedback. Otherwise, if you want to support the show, there's a couple different ways you can do that. The first is just to share it amongst your friends and family. The more that people hear the message that Bitcoin and crypto are not the same thing, the better. And I want to help people understand that. The second thing you can do is give me a 5-star review on whichever podcast app you're using. Of course, that's only if I deserve it. And last but not least, if you want to stream sats my way via the Fountain app, I'm not going to say no, but it's not expected. Thank you so much for your support thus far. It means the world to me. I appreciate the hell out of you, and the best is yet to come. Much love, friends. I'll see you on the other side.